I've been writing some lessons for the Seek the Old Paths on marriage and the home. And as I wrote those lessons, I thought, I ought to be preaching some of these things. And we really need lessons on the home. So many of the problems that we face today really go back to home problems. And I see people making decisions, and sometimes it just makes me sick. I think, have they thought about what they're doing to their home as they make these decisions? And what is that? So I thought it'd be a good idea for us to go back and look at some things that God said about the home. And I'd been thinking about that. And then this week, I got a package in the mail from House to House, Heart to Heart. And it's an 8-lesson correspondence course on the home. And I started looking through those lessons, and I tell you, I really appreciate Alan Webster, what he does. He's not telling us what he thinks about the home. He's gone to the Bible to say, what does the Bible say about these things? And he's presented them in the way that he always presents things so well. And I thought those would be good. Those would be 8 good sermons I could preach on the home. Now, I'm not going to spend all of my preaching on Sunday morning on that, but I'm going to work myself through this as we go through. And we're going to have some lessons on the home. And I'm going to use these kind of as a guide for the subject matter and some base material. Now, I'll turn them into my own lessons. I want to stop right here and explain a little bit about what I do here in preaching. And I know preachers that would criticize me for this, and they will say very proudly, they say, well, anytime you stand up to preach, it ought to always be your own material. Well, I tell you, that is very difficult to do. Let me tell you what I do, just as a preacher here. This is how I spend a lot of time at this, and this is what I do. I teach a Sunday morning class, and I'm using material from Apologetics Press to do that. And then I'll preach. Now this afternoon, I'll go to the Webb House and do a devotional, and I'll preach again tonight. So that's 4 lessons on a Sunday and then a Wednesday night class. So that's 5 lessons a week. But not only that, I'm preaching 5 times a week over the radio. That's 10 lessons a week. That's about 500 presentations I make a year. And these preachers that say, well, you ought to always use all your own material, I'm thinking, I don't think they preach very much. I mean, that's a lot of work to get all that done. And I do not take any of these. When I take a lesson like this, like I did Hardeman sermons on, I don't take it, I don't just try to repeat and read off what they do. No, I give it my thought. I like the way one Warren County preacher told me. He said, when I prepare my sermons, I milk a lot of cows, but I churn my own butter. And I think that's a pretty good way to express it. Now, a lot of my material is what you might call more like original material. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about greatness in the kingdom of God. It's in the bulletin. That's the lesson. And I wasn't copying somebody's sermon outline when I did that. And I'll do that with Mark and Isaiah and the Psalms and in the 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus lessons that I'm doing now. But a lot of times I take these helps. And one of the advantages of doing this is you get to hear from someone besides me. Now, it might be my voice, but my style and my presentations are not the only thing you need to hear. And Alan Webster, I really appreciate what he does. And I won't be just copying him, but you're going to hear some of Alan Webster combined with Bill Boyd in this. And both of us are going to be trying to do this to draw out of the scriptures. I don't think it's my goal as a preacher to be original. That's not my goal. My goal is to teach God's Word. And if I can use someone else's material that'll help teach God's Word, I'm all for that. And so I'm going to use some of these lessons to help me in this, in regard to these lessons concerning the home. And this first lesson, The name of the whole course is God's design for the family. And its first lesson is 21 most important words ever spoken on marriage. We'll get to those words in just a minute. But I really am attracted to that title, God's design. What should the family be like? Now, how do you know what your family ought to be like? And a lot of us have learned what families ought to be like from our own families. And that's pretty good if you have a culture that has been dedicated and has a background in it, what God has said. And so when that infiltrates the culture and you see families like this, you know how to model your own family after the families that you've been part of and the families you've seen. But as a culture drifts further and further from God's design, then you're going to have generations growing up with families that don't model what God's design says. They don't know how to have a family. In fact, the models they may be choosing may be the wrong models. And so we can't just depend on what we were raised with or what our culture has done or what we see around us. We need to go back and find out what God's design for the family is. And God had a plan. God has a design. And we would be better off to just go back and see what that is. Now, the 21 most important words ever spoken on marriage. He's talking about those words that were in the beginning. God made heaven and earth and all that in them is, and He made Adam and put him in the garden. And as God made everything, it says He saw that it was very good. But then we read in Genesis 2 about something that was not good. Now, there was no sin. This wasn't about sin and something went wrong. It's just something wasn't complete. It was not good. What's not good? It was not good for man to be alone. Well, God wanted Adam to realize this. Bring the animals in. Adam, what are you going to name them? You give me names for these animals. Adam sees all the animals and creatures God has made, and he names them and realizes, well, there's nothing here suitable for me. What about my companion? And so God caused a deep sleep to fall upon Adam. And He took his rib, and from that rib He made woman and brought her to the man. That'd be like in our wedding ceremonies, it's usually the father that brings the bride down the aisle. I wonder how it was for God to bring Eve to Adam in that first marriage ceremony and brought her to the man. And then that's where these words are uttered. It's in Genesis 2 and verse 24. Now this gets to the very beginning of marriage and the home. The first instructions we have from this. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Now, who said that? Where'd this come from? Well, go back to Genesis chapter 2, and it says Adam said this. And look at verse 23. And Adam said, this is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She shall be called woman because she's taken out of man. Therefore shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they shall be one flesh. Adam, what do you know about this? Why, you're just brand new. You're not even one day old yet, Adam. And how do you know so much about what the home ought to be and what marriage ought to be? How was it that Adam would say this? Now, he is the father, the first father of us all. He wasn't a father yet. In fact, there were not even fathers and mothers yet. He's looking into the future as he lays this out. Well, it's not just Adam. I know we read in Genesis 2, Adam said. But Jesus quotes this passage in the New Testament. And here we read something else that we probably could have inferred from Genesis 2 if we'd been reading carefully, but now it's spelled out explicitly for us. It's in Matthew chapter 19, 3 through 5, where the Pharisees came unto him, they came to Jesus, tempting him, saying, "Is it lawful for a man to put away his wife for every cause?" And he, this is Jesus, Jesus answered and said to them, "Have ye not read?" Now here it is. "He which made them at the beginning, made them male and female, and said." Now who said it? He which made them at the beginning said this. What did he say? Well, he said what Adam said. "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and cleave to his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh." Well, who said it? God said this. God had Adam say this, but God gave Adam what he was supposed to say. If you talk about who is the first prophet, I think I'd go back to Adam. A prophet is God's spokesman. And from the very beginning, God delivered his word to us through this prophet. Adam was speaking the words that God had given him to speak. And since God had given Adam these words, then you say, "He which made them at the beginning said." Now God knew what he's talking about. He knew why he had made them. And in making them at the beginning, he gave this looking forward to the future, when there would be families, and there would be fathers, and there would be mothers, and there would be children growing up in those homes that would go out and they would get married and have families of their own. And so these are very important words, aren't they? This is so fundamental. The thing is, this is so fundamental that this home is established before sin enters into the world. We don't read about sin until we get to Genesis chapter 3. Now just think about that. If there had been no sin, there would have been no scheme of redemption. There would have been no blood sacrifice. There would have been no cross or atonement or propitiation. There would have been no church. But there would still be a home. Now that is how fundamental marriage, home, and family is to God's plan. In this world, we would be so much better off if we would all just say, we're going to do it God's way. We're going to follow God's plan. That's what's going to be the model for our home. So much of the social ills that we cover today, the violence in this world, the ugly shootings, the perversions, the unruliness that's going on in this world, it's traced back to a home failure. And we need to acknowledge God in our homes and realize, look, God's the one that set this up. He is the authority for the home. And God has a plan. Now, God loves us. This whole thing about having a marriage and a home and a family is for our happiness and for our joy. And some of the worst griefs and misery that we bring upon ourselves, we bring upon ourselves because we think we're going to do something different than what God said. We think this is going to fit us better than what God said, but it doesn't. And it brings hardship and sorrow. And so it's a good idea to get back and see what God said. Now, if everybody will have followed God's plan. Here's what God's plan is. It's really easy to remember. It's one man and one woman joined together by one God to be one flesh for one life. It's when we get to the New Testament that we find there's one exception. And you know that one exception is mentioned in only one place. That's God's plan. It's not like it's real difficult to figure it out and see. That's the basics. And so we need to follow God's plan. Make sure we get that right. Man didn't want to follow God's plan. People today don't follow it. And many, many homes are in misery because they hadn't followed God's plan. But it's not new that people think they can do different than what God's plan. Lamech didn't follow God's plan. Lamech took to himself 2 wives. That wasn't God's plan. The sons of God saw the daughters of men and took them wives of all they chose. That wasn't God's plan. We read about Ham, and the language is a little mysterious here, but it says that he saw his father's nakedness. That wasn't God's plan. We read about Sodom. Sodomy. What they were doing in Sodom wasn't God's plan. We read about Lot's daughters who bore children after they got their own father drunk and lay with him. That wasn't God's plan. We read about Sarai. Abraham, I can help you out. Here, Abram, take my handmaid Hagar, and bore Ishmael. That wasn't God's plan. We read about Esau that had 3 wives. And Jacob, what did he do? He married sisters and took their handmaids. That wasn't God's plan. We read about Judah, who bore sons from his daughter-in-law. That wasn't God's plan. We read about David, who had many wives, and then Solomon, 300 wives and 700 concubines. That wasn't God's plan. And so it's not uncommon. Down through the years, man has deviated from God's plan. And that's what's the problem's been with the homes. Is people not following God's plan. Solomon said that he found among 1,000 women, he found not one. And it was all vanity and vexation, and he was miserable. Those 1,000 women didn't make Solomon happy. I tell you, he should have stuck with one. He'd have been a lot better off. And so we need to get back and think, what is God's plan? Let's look at the 3 parts from the beginning here about God's plan. And the first one will pull at your heartstrings. Therefore shall a man leave his father and his mother. I tell you, you love your children. It's a natural affection. Those little children, in fact, I've heard Marion Turner, he's always coming up. He said, well, they say his mother thought his mother loved him. Someone that no one else can love, but the mother's going to love you. And your father and mother, they love their children. They're so precious to them. And these children have a natural affection for their parents. They love their parents, and they just grow up admiring them and honoring them and loving them. It's a natural affection. And yet the time comes when a son or daughter is going to choose someone to be their spouse. And they leave their father and their mother. Oh, that's why people cry at weddings. Because this natural affection, and as strong a bind as it is, I tell you what, when you decide you're going to have a spouse, you've made a decision now, and even above natural affection, you're responsible for your decisions. And you've got to leave father and mother. That husband or that wife that you choose are now more important to you than your own father and your own mother. And fathers and mothers have to realize that and step back. Oh, you want to help them. You want to be there for them. Why, those kids, they don't know what they're getting into. They're going to need me, and they do. But you know, a lot of time what they need you to do is step back and let them learn to depend on one another. You leave them. Now, leave them physically. I used to say you need to live far enough away to make a long-distance phone call. Now, that was my own thing, but that doesn't matter anymore. You know, with the cell phone, you don't get people saying, I'm calling long distance anymore. But there needs to be a physical separation. A young couple getting married, they need to have their space. And I hear about sometimes people that they get married and move right in with one of the others, mom and dad, right in their own house. I tell you, it is going to be hard to have a fight with your in-laws there or your parents there. You just can't have a good fair fight that way. And the time's going to come, you're going to have to, listen, you're young and you're going to have to learn how to do this, and it's going to be frustrating. And so you got to be able to have that first fight on your own terms, don't you? And know how to work this out. You got to leave physically. And you better be able to leave economically. You cannot be independent if you're not economically independent. My dad's expression to me was, when I was growing up, is you got to learn to paddle your own canoe. That's what it is. And I tell you, you might think, well, now the parents think, well, we'll help them. We've got some money, and we'll help them. And they'll think, well, no, we'll take that. We need a little help. And then what do? Well, they go off on some vacation somewhere, and you think, is that why did I give them money so they can run down and go off and do it? And you don't feel like it's hard to really let them make their own decisions with your money that you're giving them. You need to get up and be financially independent. You see, marriage is not for children. It's for grown folks. You got to be mature enough to know how to take care of yourself. And so you got to leave them economically. But then the real tough one is this. You've got to leave them emotionally. Now, that doesn't mean you don't love your mom and dad anymore. No, you love them dearly. But you've got to learn to lean on each other. And both, most of the time when you get married, you are very young, and you wonder, is there very much there to lean on? Well, by leaning, you'll grow stronger. You've just got to learn to depend on one another. And young men can't be running back to mama, and young girls can't be running back to daddy. They've got to learn. We've got a crisis. We've got to run to each other. And so you leave your father and your mother, and you stand on your own 2 feet in your own home. And then cleave to your wife. Those two words sound alike, and I don't know if the translators meant to do that, but there's leave and cleave, isn't it? Now, I know you can get a cleaver, and that's for separating things. Now, it's not talking about that kind of cleave. Don't cleave your wife that way. Cleave to your wife. And as I understand the word, it means to be glued together. Okay, make that super glue, okay? If it's going to glue together, make it super glue. And I heard some very wise advice. There was a man came to a couple, they'd been married for years, and they'd had, just like all of our histories of our marriage, we go through tough times, and they'd made it, and they'd been married 40 or 50 years, and here's this This young man, he'd been married maybe a few months or a year or two, and he said, this is rough. How do you do this? How do you all stay married for 40, 50 years like this? What do you do? And the old man had some very wise advice. Here it is. You got to hang in there. That's how you do it. It doesn't mean it's going to be easy. But you've got to cleave. You just got to hang in there. I tell you what, things change. Things change. And things look like they're going great, and they'll change on you. But sometimes things look like they're going terrible, and they change on you too. And they get a lot better. And what you have to do is decide of all the options we're going to have, the one option we're not going to have is to stop cleaving. We're going to cleave. That's it. And we're going to have to look at other options besides ending this. We're going to cleave and figure this out some way, and we'll bear through it till we get to the other side. And so you got to be careful. Don't let parents get in the middle of that. Don't let your children get into the middle of that. Don't let friends get in the middle of that. You watch those jobs and careers, they can get in the middle of that. Don't let your own special interest get in the middle of that. What's the priority? It's cleaving to your husband and cleaving to your wife. And everything else is going to have to find its place, because that's going to be set. So leave your father and mother. Cleave to your wife, and then this. They shall be one flesh. Now I know involved in that includes that physical intimacy that God has designed for a man and a woman. Now, I know that's got to be part of what it is to cleave, to be one flesh, but that's not all it is. That's part of it, and that is reserved only for those who are married to one another. That's part of it, but that's only the beginning. She is now bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. And he is now bone of your bone and flesh of your flesh. And this helps us understand Ephesians 5:28 through 29. So ought men to love their wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. For no man yet hated his own flesh, but nourisheth and cherisheth it. How are you going to take care of that wife? What are you going to do to take care of her? You take care of her like that's you. And wives, you take care of your husband like that's you. You say, you got 4 pairs of eyes now, not 2. You've got 4 hands now and not 2. You look at each other. I'm going to take care of her body the way I would take care of my body. If she is suffering, I am suffering, and I'm going to find out how to fix it. If he is rejoicing, I am rejoicing. This is my husband, and I love him. I'm going to rejoice with him. And you share those successes and those hurts together, and you look after one another. That's what it means to be one flesh. It's no longer living for yourself. You're living for each other in this marriage. And so the two shall become one. And then it goes a little further than this, a little further than that. And I want us to think now about how our lives become entwined. I know they do financially. I hope they do. I know some people say, well, now this is my money and this is his money. and then this is our money. Well, that's not a very good way to start. It's all, everyone. Just share it together. It's all of you. And what you do, see, the most important thing to do with my money is to see that she is able to get what she needs and wants with that money. And that's what she's thinking. The most important thing to do with my money is to see that he's able to use it for what he needs and he wants. And it's ours together. It's not yours and mine. It becomes ours. And then all your lives, you want that entwined. Find ways to make your lives just weave and blend together. Find interests that are important to both of you. I know you may have your own interests, but those take secondary place to mutual interest. Find and nurture mutual interests. And if you got to learn new interests to do that, find some new interests to learn. Now, let me give a piece of advice. And I know everyone here may not be able to do that, but if you're not married, you better listen up. Here's some good advice. You want to find someone you like to go to church with. That's what if you'll do that, if you'll marry someone you like to go to church with, you're going to bring your religious life entwined. I tell you what, and I'm not saying I'm the great example for everything, but I tell you what Lori and I love to do. We like to go to church together. I mean, that has been so much a part of who we are as a husband and wife. And we took all our kids, and now there's 3 gospel meetings going on this week. I'm going to I might get both of them to Justin since he's my son-in-law what they're preaching at Oak Grove this week. But we try to get to as many as we can, and we schedule that, and it's a lot of fun. We go and we get to sit together, we get dressed up, and then we go sit together, and then we sing songs together, and we listen to something intelligent together, and we can discuss it together, and we make friends together. A lot of time we'll take that time to go out to eat together. And you talk about what a wonderful way to bring ourselves together. And so find ways to bring your lives entwined so that it's no longer your life. Here's the way I'll put it. You get married, it's no longer Bill and Lori. Put it together as one word, Bill and Lori. That's what it's going to be. It's going to be Bill and Lori. That's how we work together. And so you become one. And look what it says in Genesis 5, verses 1 and 2. This is the book of the generations of Adam. In the day that God created man, in the likeness of God made he him, male and female created he them, and blessed them, and called their, plural, their name Adam. In the day in which they were created. It's not just Adam and Eve. No, we got Mr. and Mrs. Adam here. That's what we have. Their name becomes synonymous one with another, and they share a name because their lives are to be together. Well, that's how this starts off. Now, here's where these lessons are going, okay? Today, we did the 21 most important words ever spoken on marriage. Next time I do this, it's going to be biblical views of sexuality. And then how to help your spouse make it to heaven. And God's 7 financial goals for your family. What Jesus said about divorce. How to resist temptation. How to stay faithful to your spouse. And be married for life. Now, I'll go back to this. I want you to look how we begin here. That right there. There's 5 of these out there on that table. 5 of these. So take one, or if you know someone that needs it, take one of those. After today, they're too big for the track rack, but I've already tested. I can kind of fold them and stick them in the track rack, and I'll do that and try to keep them lined up if they're not taken. I don't have one for everyone, but there's 5 of those out there. And there's a lot more material in that than I've covered in this sermon, and I'm going to try to do that with these 2. Use this as an introduction to what that correspondence course lesson has in it. And then if you want to go further into this, take one of those and take it with you. In everything. In everything. We're always better off if we'll just go by God's plan. and humble ourselves before Him and rejoice in that we have this guidance and love God's law. And that has to do with the church. That's what we've been talking about. Listen, that has to do with the home. And that's how we prepare for eternity. If you need to be baptized into Christ this morning, we have an opportunity to do that as we sing the invitation song.